What, did you hear the story about the doctor, the engineer, and the politician who were sitting in a room one day, and they were arguing back and forth which of their professions was the oldest? And so the doctor begins and says, well, I read in the Bible that God created Eve out of Adam's rib. He carved that rib out of Adam, so obviously, my profession as a surgeon is the oldest. Engineer says, hold on one second. Wait, even before that, think about it. Even before that, it says that God created the 6 days out of chaos. He made order out of chaos. He said, that's the job of an engineer. So obviously, my job is older than yours. And that's when the politician piped up. He said, hold on just a second. Who created the chaos? We're going to study an account today where a politician created some chaos in the life of Daniel. You have a Bible today? Let's head in the direction of Daniel chapter 6, shall we? Join me there. That's where we're going to drop anchor. That's where we're going to spend our time. We are roughly halfway through our study now. We've been calling it Against the Flow. Subtitled, We're Residents of Jerusalem Living in Babylon. And I guess just a major premise in this study, this idea that our citizenship isn't another place. We're living as exiles in an alien culture, in a foreign culture, and consequently, it takes boldness and courage to stand up for godly values. It takes boldness and courage to go against the flow. Our sermon title today out of Daniel chapter 6 is Dare to be a Daniel. And the text before us today, certainly one of the most familiar in the entire Bible, certainly a favorite of children, but hopefully, I hope that you'll see by the time we're done that it's far more than just a bedtime story, and there's incredibly timely truth for us in the account today. So how about we do this? Let me just set the stage. Hopefully you picked up an outline. If you wanted one, we make them available as you come through the door. And take advantage of that if you'd like. You can fill in some of those blanks or write down additional references that I give you. But we want that to be a resource for you. The historical setting for the events recorded in Daniel 6 is really found in the last 2 verses of chapter 5. And that's exactly where we left off last week, right? So on the night that Babylon fell to the Medo-Persian armies, King Belshazzar was slain, and it tells us there that Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. So we have a shift now, don't we, in power, a shift in administrations. And if you were with us for our study of chapter 2, then maybe you recall how Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and this was actually one of the events that Daniel predicted, wasn't it? Remember the transition from the head of gold representing Babylon to the chest and arms of silver. In fact, you might recall how we pointed out that the duality of the 2 arms there suggests a twofold division to this kingdom, the twofold division of the Medes and the Persians. So you can see we're already witnessing the accuracy of Daniel's prophecy, aren't we? We're already seeing it play out, and we will far more in the weeks ahead. But you can see it's happening exactly as Daniel had foretold. Now, apparently, since Daniel had close to 65 to 70 years of government experience with the Babylonian kingdom, he's now retained to help with the establishment of this new administration as Darius the Mede comes into power. Think about that. This is now the second earthly kingdom that God has positioned his servant to influence. What can we learn from his example today? Well, I divided it into 5 lessons. If we're going to dare to be a Daniel, there's 5 key lessons that come through in this passage that I think can find application in our lives. The first one would be this. Lesson number 1, we need to recognize that persecution is inevitable. You have the text open on your lap there, have access to it. We'll dive in at verse 1. What's it say? It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set over him the whole kingdom. Let me make it clear here. A satrap is not a golf hazard, okay? You know, where your ball rolls into a hole filled with sand. A lot of people make that mistake, but actually a satrap is a Persian official who ruled over a province, i.e. a small group of people. And you can see it there in the text. In this new administration, 120 officials are appointed and set over the various provinces to hold down rebellion and to collect taxes. These officials were responsible to 3 presidents, who in turn answered directly to the king. And so the text spells it out for us here that one of the 3 administrators who was selected was none other than Daniel, who at this point is probably in the neighborhood of 85, 86 years of age. Now, if you stop and think about it, that was a really wise choice, right? It made a great deal of sense. As I've already indicated, Daniel's long experience and wide acquaintance with the Babylonian government would have made him an exceptionally qualified candidate to serve in this capacity. And the text also makes it clear, doesn't it, that once appointed, Daniel proved himself more than capable. In fact, Darius is so impressed that he now plans to promote Daniel to an even greater position of authority. Well, unfortunately, the prophet's upcoming promotion didn't exactly tickle everyone pink. Instead, some of his fellow government officials turned green with envy. The fact that Daniel, an outsider, was about to be elevated to such a position did not set well with the other Medo-Persian leaders. And so what do? Look at it, verse 4. They start digging for dirt, don't they? At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Can you imagine that, gang? Can you imagine somebody hiring a private investigator to look into every aspect of your life? Public and private, past and present. What would they uncover? What if they checked your high school and college records? What if they listened in on your phone calls? What if they scrutinized your financial records and your tax returns and your business deals? What if they visited your internet history, the videos you watch, or maybe what you did on vacation? What if they looked into every relationship you've ever had, or how you act on the job, how you deal with the opposite sex, how you treat your spouse, your children, your vocabulary at home, the jokes you tell, the places that you visit? Could any of us survive that kind of scrutiny? Daniel did. This is one of the few guys in the biblical record which we have a substantial amount of material about his life, and there's nothing negative recorded about him. That doesn't happen too often in the Bible, because the Bible's it just puts it all out there, paints an accurate picture, warts and all, but you don't find that in Daniel's life. And that's why in verse 5, look at it, his enemies finally say, we're never going to find any basis for charge against this guy unless it has something to do with his God and the law of his God. And so as a result, in verse 6 and following, Daniel's jealous peers cleverly deceived King Darius into signing a law that would forbid prayer to anyone other than the king for the next 30 days. And anybody who violated that law, the penalty would be tossing them into the lion's den. Now notice that everything they told the king wasn't true, was it? Did you pick up on that? These men lied to Darius when they told him that all the officials under him had consented to the enactment of this proposal. But we know that Daniel was never consulted. So they lied to the king, and then we read a little bit further, they pressure him to sign their document into law. And Darius, of course, hey, this sounds pretty good. Nobody's praying to any other god but me. I think I could handle that for 30 days. And so he goes along with it, making the injunction irrevocable according to Medo-Persian law. That's the way they operated. Once something was written into law, it was chiseled in cement. It didn't change. Now, in one sense, what was happening to Daniel here shouldn't surprise us, should it? Because the prophet is a godly man living a godly life in a very ungodly culture. And you know what that means, don't you? Persecution is inevitable. If that's our goal, to live a godly life in an ungodly culture, we're going to get some pushback. And we can substantiate that in numerous places. If we went over into the New Testament, the Apostle Paul wrote these words in his last letter. He said, in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. I mean, there it is, right? Earlier, he has said this in Philippians 1:29, it's been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. When we align ourselves with Jesus, we're aligning ourselves for suffering. And I know that's not a pleasant subject or a popular subject, but it is one that the Bible clearly teaches. A new report was released just over a week ago. It comes out of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And just to give you a summary, I won't go into all the gory details today, but the report reveals a heightened religious persecution across the entire planet. I mean, it's mind-boggling how our brothers and sisters in Christ are suffering in different places around this world. And I've made the case, I did back on week 1 as we began this study, that there's a growing antagonism here in the States towards God's people and godly values. We sense that. We don't need anybody to tell us. We don't need a report to confirm it. We can sense that in our activities and our dealings. So what we're reading here in the book of Daniel should not surprise us. Persecution is inevitable. Lesson number 2, boldness is indispensable. Daniel did have one flaw. He was utterly predictable when it came to his prayer life. And you can see it there in verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. What an incredible verse. I've actually preached an entire sermon on Daniel 6, verse 10 alone. So much there to unpack. Daniel knew that the declaration had been signed. He was aware of the danger that he was in, but it didn't change a thing, did it? Put yourself in Daniel's sandals for just a second. Stop and think about how easy it would have been for him to rationalize at this point, right? I mean, he could have begun to reason along these lines. You know, God has blessed me in this pagan country. I've climbed the political ladder. I now have this position of great influence. I don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. I don't want to do anything to mess that up. I'll just lay low until things die down. I'll keep my head down. It's only 30 days. God will understand if I take a short sabbatical from praying. It's only temporary. It's not long term. I'll just go over here and close the window as I pray. It's getting a little chilly in here anyway, so I'll just close that window. Or maybe I'll just pray silently. You know, silent prayers are just as effective as spoken prayers. Could have done any one of those rationalizations, couldn't he? Of course, Daniel did none of the above. The prophet knew that boldness was indispensable. And so notice, Daniel doesn't go to the marketplace to make his prayer a political act. He doesn't send word to the authorities announcing his intentions. There was no parade. There was no outward show of religion. No, instead, as was his custom, 3 times a day, 9, 12, and 3, he got down on his knees. Why? Well, because that was his habit. This wasn't something new for Daniel. It was his lifestyle. Daniel doesn't add prayer to his schedule because of the current crisis. He wasn't praying to make a political statement. In fact, the end of verse 10, you see it there, just as he had done before. It's part of his routine. To this man of God, prayer was the very breath of spiritual life. He couldn't live without it. To do so would have been unthinkable. All of which raises the question, if our enemies were trying to trap us in the consistency of our prayer life, would they be able to do so? If a decree was put into effect in our country outlawing prayer, how long would it take before you would be arrested? Could our enemies say about us, I know every morning, I know they're going to be on their knees at that particular time. I know every week, I know exactly where they'll be. They'll be at prayer meeting. These men knew because of Daniel's consistency. And so verse 11, they went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. One writer remarked that Daniel's bedroom was the real lion's den. That's where the battle was fought and won. Because by committing himself to continuing in prayer, he won the only battle that mattered. When he won there, the real lions were not an issue. You see, Daniel believed it's better to die for a conviction than to live with a compromise. Better to die for a conviction than to live with a compromise. The question again naturally follows, if we were faced with a similar challenge, would we be able to hold true to our values? Would we hold to our convictions, or would we just go with the flow? Because here's the reality, gang. It's not hard to see how some of these very similar challenges could be confronting us in the days ahead, in the not-too-distant future. I don't know if you saw this in the news this past week, but California just launched a new hotline for residents to report hate acts. So you can snitch on your neighbor now in California. This past Thursday, Governor Gavin Newsom, the California Civil Rights Department, announced the launch of California vs. Hate. And through the hotline, Californians will be able to tell on their neighbors who are committing hate acts. What's a hate act, you ask? Well, the website says a hate incident is a hostile expression or action that may be motivated by bias against another person's actual or perceived identity. Goes on to say that perpetrators may be motivated by different discriminatory biases, including but not limited to bias based on race, color, disability, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender, including gender identity. Some examples of hate incidents, according to the website, are refusing service, derogatory name calling, and bullying. The new hotline, Newsom explained, is an unequivocal message that hate will not be tolerated in California. That's just one example, isn't it? Just one example where you can see the law of the land confronting us as believers if we take a stand on truth. Persecution is inevitable. Boldness is indispensable. Lesson number 3, confidence is unshakable. As you might guess, Daniel's enemies waste no time in exposing his disobedience to the king. So you can see it there in verse 12 and following. After reminding the emperor of the injunction that he had signed into law, they now disclose Daniel's violation of it. So they got on the hotline, right? They got on the hotline and they called it in. And what's interesting, in verse 14, Darius realizes that he's been taken, he's been duped. And he's not happy about it. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So clearly we see in that section that the king thought very highly of his valued administrator. In fact, if the accusers had realized how highly he thought of him, there's a good chance they might not have ever attempted this scheme. But finding no way out of the dilemma, Darius here ultimately consents to carry out the sentence. And yet, even as the stone is being brought and placed over the mouth of the den, it was Darius who cried out to the prophet, "May your God, Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." Again, there's so much there to unpack, that this pagan king would say, "Your God, who you continually serve." He knew that Daniel continually served his God, didn't he? I also find it noteworthy that there's no indication anywhere in this passage that Daniel resisted. We don't see that, do we? Clearly, he resigns himself to the lion's den as part of God's plan for his life. How in the world could he do that? Well, it has to come down to his quiet confidence in God's sovereignty, doesn't it? The author of the epistle to the Hebrews will later make that clear. Hebrews chapter 11, look how he expressed it here. He says, "What more shall I say?" After recognizing numerous heroes of the faith in the opening verses of chapter 11, he says, "I don't have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets," which would include Daniel, right? And the prophets who through, what's the next word? Who through faith. What's faith? Faith is trust, and it's trust in God's plan. It's confidence in his actions. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. Clearly Daniel falls into that camp, quenched the fury of flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle, routed foreign armies, women received back their dead, raised to life again. All these victories he's describing in this section of Hebrews chapter 11, and he includes Daniel in that section, doesn't he? And we know that Daniel, just like his three buddies in chapter 3, he absolutely refused to buckle under the king's edict. Daniel at this stage isn't sure how this thing is going to go. He's not sure how it's going to play out, but he had an unshakable confidence in God's power. His attitude was the same as Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego's when they said to Nebuchadnezzar, "If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to." We know God can do it. We know he can. And one way or another, King, he's going to rescue us from your hand. But even if he does not, even if this doesn't happen like we would hope or in the way that we would want, we want you to know, O King, that we're not going to serve your gods and we're not going to worship the image of gold that you've set up. And that's exactly what Daniel is saying here now in chapter 6. This is the third time in this book, isn't it? Third time in this book that we've seen examples of civil disobedience. We saw it in chapter 1 when Daniel and company said we're not going to eat the royal diet. That's been offered to pagan gods. That's been offered to idols. We're not going to eat that food. We saw it in chapter 3. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We'll use their biblical names there. Our three buddies resisted the order to worship the image. And now here it is again in chapter 6 as Daniel says, no way to this royal edict. I said it a couple weeks ago. I'm going to say it again this morning because it fits here. As followers of Christ, our goal is to be model citizens, right? We make it our goal to obey every law and legislation that comes down from our government, whether it's national, state, or local. We obey every law that comes from human government until it comes into conflict with God's laws. We're model citizens until it conflicts with God's law. And at that point, God's laws always take precedent over man-made laws. In the classic text there, many of you would know it, Acts 5:29, when Peter and the apostles are threatened, no more teaching, no more preaching in the name of Jesus. And what was their response? That was a government edict. That was the law coming down from above. And what was their response? We must obey God rather than man. So persecution is inevitable, boldness is indispensable, confidence is unshakable. Lesson number 4, deliverance is possible. Look at verse 18. The king returned to his palace, and he spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Archaeological evidence indicates that the lion's den that's being described here was more than likely a cave that had been excavated for that specific purpose. And so usually it would have consisted of a large square cavern under the earth, and then they would put a partition wall right in the middle of it. The partition had a door so that when the keepers threw down the food, they could entice the lions into one chamber and then go down and clean up the other that was vacant. So likewise, the cavern here, as it's being described in the text, had an opening at the top which enabled one to look down into the den. And it was over that opening that they placed this heavy stone, sealing it with moist clay tablets, and then Darius and his nobles would press their signet rings into that clay, mark it, seal it, and that official act meant that no one had the right to alter that situation. If you were to move that stone or disrupt it in any way, you would end up in the lion's den. Somebody said, it's better to be a child of faith in a lion's den than to be a king without God in a palace. And that certainly plays out here, doesn't it? I don't know about you, but I'm thinking Daniel had the more restful sleep that night. I like to picture maybe Daniel using one lion for a soft pillow and the long flowing mane of another for a blanket. I'm guessing most of you know how the story ends, but let's make sure we're all aware of the details. We'll pick it up at verse 19. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, there it is again, right? Whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? I'm sure there was just like a pause there, right? He's waiting. Am I going to hear anything? Is Daniel still alive? You just got to try to put yourself in that setting. Imagine what he was going through. And then Daniel answers, "O king, live forever," right? My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, O king. And the king was overjoyed, and he gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him. Why? Look at it. Because he had trusted in his God. There's that confidence factor again, right? Now, I need to hurry on to say, we understand, right? We need to acknowledge it doesn't always work out this way. We're grateful when it does, right? And we know God is capable of it. But it doesn't always work out that way. That's why lesson number 4 says deliverance is possible as opposed to deliverance will happen. It's not a matter of naming it and claiming it. Sometimes God allows the suffering, even the death of his saints for his glory. But that doesn't change the ultimate triumph that is ours. And that's, again, very obvious to us if we go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Remember that text I read just a few short moments ago, after the author's describing in detail all the glowing victories and miracles of God's people and how God delivered them and how God came through. And you get to the middle of verse 35, and it says, others. Wait, what? Others. Others were tortured and refused to be released so they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, still others chained, put in prison. They were stoned, sawed in two, put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised. The idea there is they didn't see it happen in this life. They didn't see it materialize in this existence. Well, how did they do it? How did they face that kind of oppression? How did they hang in there and persevere? The answer comes in that chapter, Hebrews 11. I think a key component is verse 16. You see, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. And for God's not ashamed to be called their gods, because he has prepared a city for them. How did they do it? They clung to their hope that a better existence awaited them. They recognized this world is not my home. I have a citizenship in another kingdom. You see, gang, ultimately the book of Daniel is not about the prophet's rescue here in chapter 6. It's about the survival of God's people. It's about the fact that we will all be victorious in Christ. In fact, we'll skip ahead. Let's fast forward to chapter 12. We'll get there eventually in this series. But let me just, spoiler alert here, chapter 12, verse 1. But at that time, what time? It's the passage, you can look at it later. It's talking about the consummation of all things, the coming of the kingdom. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. It's going to happen. The deliverance is coming in God's timing. And remember, these words are being written to a people who are living right now in exile. They've been carried away from the homeland. They're citizens of Jerusalem, and yet they're residing in Babylon. And yet even these small deliverances that Daniel and the others experienced in this life, were meant to give them hope and confidence of a final deliverance that most certainly would come. And so it is for you and me. The small victories, the small deliverances that God gives us in this life should offer us hope. They're a preview. They're a down payment, if you will, on the final great deliverance that will ultimately come for all of God's people. Persecution is inevitable, boldness indispensable, confidence unshakable, deliverance possible, and finally, lesson number 5, influence is unmistakable. Let's wrap it up at verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. He is the one who endures forever. His kingdom won't be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Once again, we have an edict of a pagan king that sounds remarkably similar to a Psalm of David. We saw that back with Nebuchadnezzar earlier in the book, right? Darius here is so touched by this man's life that he writes what amounts to a psalm of worship to the one true God. I've already alluded to it, but I'll just point it out once again. Daniel is one man that greatly influenced 2 kingdoms, 2 empires. And how did he do it? It was because of his consistent integrity. What's that tell us? It tells us that it doesn't take a lot of people to make a difference. It just takes the right people, doesn't it? When people are bold in their God and live with courage and convictions, they can't help but impact the lives of others around them. And so just like Daniel, now here we are thousands of years later, and we're being called now to step up. We're being called to be people of influence, right? The same call comes to us today. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. So in the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." We're to be people of influence. We're to be taking that light into the darkness. Some of you no doubt recognize the title of my message today comes from an old hymn by the same name. If you've been around the church for any length of time, you might have recognized that hymn, Dare to be a Daniel. A portion of those lyrics go like this: Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. Dare to make it known. You know, in one sense, we're facing that decision each and every day. Not quite as intense as what Daniel was facing here, But each and every day we're facing that decision. Every Christian must decide daily whether to be loyal to Jesus or to give into this age and just go with the flow. Which will it be for you? It was certainly difficult to keep the faith in Daniel's day, and in all likelihood, it will get tougher for us in the days ahead. Now's the time to decide. What choice will you make? Will you dare to be a Daniel? In my research this past week, I ran across a slogan of an African-American church in Kansas City that pretty much summarizes our discussion this morning. So I'm going to share this with you. I think this is too good not to share. So this is their mission slogan. It goes like this: wake up, sing up, preach up, pray up, and pay up. But never give up or let up, back up or shut up until the cause of Christ in this church and in this world is built up. Amen? It's a worthy goal, and one I hope that characterizes our individual lives and the corporate life of this fellowship. You know, whatever's coming, whatever we face, part of the reason I had you memorize the passages that I did, it wasn't just random verses that Pastor Gary picked out. Joshua 1:9, Hebrews 13:5 and 6, both stress to us that we're not alone. God is with us. Whatever we're facing, He'll walk alongside of us. There still might be a few others that'll come along that I'll challenge you with. And part of the reason for that is that we can come back to these verses, that we've internalized them. We can meditate on them as we're going to sleep at night. Or maybe in the middle of intense pressure, we're able to call up a truth that will speak encouragement into our lives. Psalm 121 would certainly fall into that category. Now it's a little bit longer. It's not a long psalm, but longer than some of the assignments I've given to you to this point. And I don't know, I might have to give you a car if you memorize Psalm 121. But if you want to meditate and reflect on it, you won't be disappointed, that's for sure. This song that we'll sing in closing was written based on Psalm 121. So we'll reinforce that truth. Let's stand as we sing, shall we?